My name is Anand Pandian. I'm an anthropologist and a writer. Right now, I'm based in Baltimore, Maryland, where I teach in the Department of Anthropology at Johns Hopkins University. But I actually grew up right here in the San Fernando Valley. So it's really quite a treat to be back. We moved out here, I think, in 1980. My dad's a physician. My family is originally from India, from South India. My sister and I were born in New York, but we all moved to California in 1980. We grew up actually in Northridge, not far from here at all. And I went to elementary school at Agramont Elementary School in the North Valley and wound up doing middle school and high school at what was then Harvard, which is now Harvard Westlake in North Hollywood. Our family was part of a much larger Indian American community here in Southern California. We had other Indian families, other Indian kids that I got to know really well here in the Valley and really throughout the LA area. And so it really feels great to be back. And so we'll still meet here at Balboa Park now and then with our kids. These are places that I still have real ties to. We are an immigrant family. Our family came here from another part of the world pretty far away, and growing up with parents who still had very, very close ties to our homeland in India, to many people there, we really grew up with a sense of being from two places at once. One foot here in the United States and in Southern California and LA in particular, but also one foot culturally and socially in India, this other place really far away. So that sense that many of us carry as people from immigrant families of being sort of one foot in and one foot out is actually a pretty good description of what it's like to be an anthropologist. Because as anthropologists, what we try to do for a living really is to make sense of life in other places, of what it's like to live and to strive and to struggle so often in other parts of the world as elements of other kinds of life, of other cultures, of other ways of being in the world that are often really different from how we live here in the United States. To me, I think growing up in one place, but having these really close ties to another that I didn't know that much about, had a lot to do for me with the appeal of a field like anthropology, the idea of being able to learn about other places, beginning with India, but other places as well, as something that I could actually do for a living. And actually, this is what I wound up doing in some ways. I wound up doing volunteer work while I was still in college in rural South India. And eventually I went back to graduate school and got a doctorate in anthropology, not far from here at UC Berkeley. My research was based in India once again. I got to know other dimensions of ordinary life there that I only had access to through this kind of training and work as an anthropologist. The book is called Something Between Us because that phrase has two meanings. The phrase comes actually from James Baldwin, really important African-American essayist and writer and social thinker. And it's a phrase that he used at one point in a famous debate of his with William F. Buckley a few decades ago now. But when you think about those words, something between us, you can pick out at least two different meanings. On the one hand, you might think about the things that tie us together. But on the other hand, you might think about a barrier, something that rises up between one person and another that makes it hard to feel or experience or take seriously that connection. So what I'm trying to do in this book is to do justice to both sides of that phrase. On the one hand, I'm trying to explain why these connections are so difficult. I'm trying to pay attention to these divides. I'm trying to give people a vivid sense of why it's as hard as it is. But on the other hand, I'm also trying to say, look, here are people doing the work of connecting, whether it's racial justice activists in North Texas who have led the fight for desegregation in places that were so hostile to African Americans and other non-white folks a century ago, right? Or people fighting for clean water and environmental justice in the Hudson River Valley and teaching us what it means to think about our bodily well-being in collective terms, rather than always looking only after ourselves. Or environmental activists and climate activists who actually have walked American streets that are so hostile now to walkers as a way of insisting that our public places need to be open to pedestrians and more vulnerable roadway users rather than just given over to cars. I think all of these folks that are experimenting with other ways of imagining and practicing a different kind of social life in our country, the kind that's represented, honestly, by spaces like this one, I think that they still give us reasons to hope in times that can sometimes be really, really difficult to process and to be hopeful about. I think that there are lessons all around us for how to continue to sustain and nurture and build and rebuild that social fabric here in the United States. And we have that work to do, but we can do it by paying attention to what people are doing already and by taking up those lessons and figuring out how to carry them forward in our cities and our other public spaces for a different picture of what this country could be. All of us who come from other places and come in and out of the United States and notice the differences between what life is like here and what life continues to be like in other countries might be able to pinpoint certain patterns, certain things that come immediately to mind, certain things that we sense, say, the moment that we land at the airport and step out of that terminal, the sound of the streets, the feel of the air. Life is so different in different parts of the world. And it's important that people in different parts of the world live differently. It's important to celebrate the different cultures and different forms of heritage and experience that people have in one place as opposed to another. But it's also true that sometimes those particular ways that we get used to living in particular places can land us in a bit of trouble. And that's really what this book is about in some ways. It's about certain habits of life that we've come to take for granted here in the United States and the problems that ensue when we take those habits for granted. We live in bubbles in the United States. We live in enclosures of so many different kinds, whether it's the walls of our home or the walls of our automobiles, which are becoming increasingly box-like in shape and structure. The fact that we spend so much of our time indoors as opposed to outdoors in beautiful spaces on beautiful days like this one. Even our social media, where we get our information and our knowledge about the world, comes so often from these silos where those of us who pay attention to one platform as opposed to another, it's as though we live in completely different realities. And what I'm trying to argue in this particular book is that all of those silos, those boundaries, those different everyday walls and divides that we've come to take for granted in the United States, those boxes that we keep putting ourselves into, have a lot of effects on the way that we see other people in this country and in other parts of the world. These boxes and divisions, I argue in the book, actually rob us of the ability to really relate effectively to people outside those walls, to people with different experiences, to people with stories, unless we're sharing space with other folks in a truly meaningful way, unless we're really exposing ourselves to each other's experiences, we lose out on that ability of actually making connections across these different forms of difference that we experience. Now, I argue in the book that it has a lot to do with the kinds of impasses that we see in our social and political life right now. So we want to understand why the politics of immigration in this country has gotten so hostile, why we see so much xenophobia, why we see so much suspicion of people from other places, and sometimes even hatred, I have to say, of people with other backgrounds, other races, and so on. A lot of that has to do with some of these everyday patterns. There's a lot at stake in whether we can begin to break down those walls and figure out how to share space with each other once again. I think it's really easy to get hung up on questions of this kind. Why can't we be different? Why can't we act differently? Why can't we think differently? And I think we often act as though it's just up to us as individuals to decide to be this way or decide to be that way. But that is actually putting a lot of pressure on us as individuals. It's as though we can just choose to live this way or instead choose to live in another way. The argument that I'm trying to make in this book is that it isn't enough just to think about what we want as individuals. We also have to look at the circumstances of our lives. We have to look at what I might actually call the infrastructure of our lives. We hear that word infrastructure, we might think of highways and bridges and massive constructions, and all those things are important, but there's a much more intimate scale of infrastructure that literally has to do with how we move about in the world, whether we're on foot, in the company of others, in earshot of others, how we live with our own people, whether it's fully enclosed in spaces that have no real openings to the outside, whether we're actually spending time in intermediate spaces like porches or sidewalks or other spaces of encounter. All these everyday infrastructures of isolation and division, I think, make it harder to reach out in that way, make it harder to connect. It feels more anxiety-ridden, maybe even a little more fearful to reach out if you're used to being so separated. And so there's so much at stake in whether or not we can build other kinds of infrastructures. In fact, parks like this one. We're here at Balboa Park in the San Fernando Valley on a beautiful summer afternoon. This is a space that only existed in this form beginning in the 1990s. So it's not really a space that I got to experience very much at all when I was growing up in LA. But every time we came back, beginning in the 1990s, we would come here. We'd come here with my grandparents when they were visiting from India. We'd come here with other relatives. And there's something about spaces like this that allow for people to share their lives with others around them, I think, that can take down some of that sense of anxiety and uncertainty about reaching out. Books are really long journeys. They take a long time. They take years and years. And to be honest, you don't know where you're going to end up where you start. All I can say is that I woke up the day after the election in 2016, just feeling really troubled, feeling really disturbed by just some visceral sense of where we'd landed, what that seemed to imply for the country, but also for all of us who've come here from other places, who still have ties to other places, who still want to hold on to a more open and expansive picture of what this country, cities like Los Angeles, places like the San Fernando Valley really are. All of this was on my mind. It was really troubling. And I knew that I wanted to try to say something about it. And this is what we do as anthropologists. Our job is to try to make sense of social life. We do that by talking to people, by meeting people that we don't know that well, by spending time in places that we don't necessarily even belong in, right? But we try to get to know, we try to make sense of. And so what I thought I would do is to try to use some of my skills and experience as an anthropologist to try to understand how we got to this particular situation in our political and social life. And what that meant was spending a fair amount of time over the next few years traveling around the country, eventually spending time in more than a dozen states around the United States, on the coasts, in the parts of the story that are very much about Los Angeles and Southern California, as well as different places on the East Coast, but also in the heartland and in different parts of the United States between the coasts. Texas, Iowa, Tennessee, Colorado, right? Really trying to sort of stitch together a story both about these divisions that we've been talking about, but also, I would say, really courageous experiments that people with a greater commitment, I would say, to different forms of social, environmental, and racial justice have made in order to begin to break down those walls and to build other possibilities for our social life that I think we still have a lot to learn from. It was such a wonderful surprise to receive news of this particular award. There are organizations in this country that are dedicated to this mission of bringing people back together, of thinking critically about the politics of division, but also at the same time, how to enliven our public and collective life once again. I would say that Zócalo Public Square is one of the organizations that is really leading that effort, not only to build those kinds of spaces, but to tell stories about those spaces and to support the creation of spaces like that. So it's a tremendous honor to get this kind of recognition from an organization like Zócalo Public Square, and to think of this writing and the storytelling that I'm doing as an individual scholar and writer as part of something that ultimately has to be a larger collective project that all of us are invested in. So I'm incredibly grateful to be part of that larger conversation that they are staging for us on how to deal with the difficulties where we've landed, but also how to build viable alternatives in moving forward. This book prize is about social cohesion and how to find our way back to that once again. And it really is an honor to be able to contribute in some small way to that larger mission.